Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you might be in the world. My name is Andres Velasco. I am the Dean of the School of Public Policy here at the London School of Economics, and I welcome you to this event. I am very, very happy to be welcoming virtually, but welcoming nonetheless, to the LSE, a dear friend, a very distinguished Latin American political leader, and a Harvard professor, former President JAMIL MAHUAD from Ecuador. I will introduce him later and say a few things about his very distinguished biography. But at the outset, let me just stress what a tremendous privilege it is to be hosting President MAHUAD here at the LSE. We are also joined by my colleague, Professor Vanessa Rubio Marquez from the School of Public Policy. After President MAHUAD takes the floor and takes us, sort of the main ideas of his book, How We Dollarized Ecuador, Vanessa will have a chance to offer some remarks. I have some bad news to share. We were also hoping to have Professor Miguel Angel Santos from the School of Public Policy joining us as well, but he's been a victim of the mayhem in Britain's airports after the long weekend. He's just landed in London with a few hours delay, and he's nowhere near a computer, so I'm afraid we will have to manage without Dr. Santos's remarks. They would have been great, but we'll save them for next time. So before I introduce the speakers more formally, a few announcements. If you're using Twitter, the hashtag for today is hashtag LSE Public Policy. Let me remind people that this event is being recorded and it will be available as a podcast sooner rather than later. So what we will do is we will have a presentation from our main speaker, then some remarks from our discussant, and then I will take the chair's privilege, ask a question or two of President MAHUAD, and then we will open it up to questions from the floor. Please feel free to use the Q&A button on the Zoom screen, and I will read out the questions. Needless to say, we have limited time, but I will try to get through as many questions as possible. So let me now introduce our main guest of the early evening London time, former President JAMIL MAHUAD from Ecuador. He has a PhD in jurisprudence from the Catholic University of Ecuador and a master in public administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. He was a member of the Ecuadorian Congress, served as Minister of Labor, served as Mayor of Quito, Ecuador's capital, and of course, he also served as President of Ecuador. Among many achievements, he signed the peace treaty with Peru, which, as President Bill Clinton of the US once remarked, it resolved, the treaty that is, it resolved the hemisphere's last and oldest source of armed international conflict. For that achievement, President MAHUAD was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 1999. Getting closer to the action of today, he also dollarized the Ecuadorian economy. And of course, he will be today telling us about his book, precisely on how that achievement was arrived at and how his government worked very, very hard to put an end to both what at the time was a growing financial crisis in Ecuador and to give the Ecuadorian economy much needed monetary and financial stability through the adoption of the US dollar in that country. Since the year 2000, President MAHUAD has resided in the US, where he's been teaching leadership, negotiation, and governance at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. Among other publications, he's the co-author with Roger Fisher and Daniel Shapiro of the book, Using Emotions as You Negotiate. So I'm going to hand it over to President MAHUAD for maybe 15 minutes of his remarks and presentation of the book, and then we will move over to Professor Vanessa Rubio. Mr. President, again, what a pleasure it is to welcome you to the LSE, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be invited by LSE as an institution and to share this conversation with you, Andres, and with Vanessa. I have the privilege of knowing you for so many years. We have shared so many parts of our lives, and now this is a new endeavor. So I hope that this will be very useful for the audience. That's the main purpose of this conversation. I will start by saying that what is the problem? The doctor said to my friend Dan when he visited him here in Boston, Massachusetts. Well, Dan said, I am dizzy, I am confused, look how bloated I am exhausted. And the doctor said, you are giving me the symptoms of your problem. Now I need to do some kind of exams and tests to investigate the causes of your problem. So after a few days, they met again, and the doctor said, I checked your clinical history. I have seen that you had followed many treatments before, from diet to keep your weight balanced, exercise for your heart, and many medicines. Unfortunately, I need to tell you that these kind of treatments cannot work anymore. They work for a moment, for a time. Now they are not good for you. Unfortunately, you have a serious problem with your liver, and your only option is to get a liver transplant. Such a shocking news my friend Dan received. Now, I would like to share with you this chart. This chart is the famous 4-quadrant circle chart published by Roger Fisher, Bill Urey, and Bruce Patton in Getting to Yes. And we have here 4 steps in how to deal with a problem. The first are the symptoms. This is what the doctor asked Dan. And he said tremors, dizziness, confusion, exhaustion. Then this is the what. The doctor went to the why, the cause, and got a diagnosis. And then the prescription. You cannot adjust the old paradigm of medicines and diet and exercise. You need now a different paradigm. You need a paradigm shift, a liver transplant. This is the how to fix the problem. And then you need the treatment. To actually operate the patient and give him a new liver, you need a team of doctors, you need a patient consent, and you need a viable possibility of doing it. In this case, a liver donor. So for the treatment, you need the who, the when, and the where. It is my belief that you can use this kind of process to analyze any public policy that you want. And the dollarization of Ecuador is one of them. So what was the situation of Ecuador? If we go to the symptoms, let's talk about 2 different moments. A chronic high inflation in my country, chronic devaluation that produced social angst and political instability. But then, in 98, 99, the high inflation reached bouts of hyperinflation. We haven't had that before. And the devaluation became macro devaluation. And the social angst became social chaos. And the political instability became political turmoil. So we went to the second part, the red part, the diagnostic part. And we found that we were affected by the perfect storm scenario. We stopped exporting as a country because of the combined effects of the El Niño that destroyed all of our exports except oil, then the crash in the prices of oil, and at the same time, the world markets, remember, were closed because of the Asian crisis. So the moment we didn't have money, we didn't have dollars, we were not exporting, we need to import more because of the crisis, we couldn't get loans because the markets were closed. So in that situation, let's go to the third moment, the prescription. What can we do? The first attempt was to fix the problems with the current paradigm. That meant just to put a label to it, an IMF program. Now, this time, this program was not available for many reasons. If those reasons are of interest of the audience, we can go there later. So that was not open to our reach. We couldn't get a paradigm fix. We needed a paradigm shift, similar to liver transplant in the case of Dan. And that meant to handcuff the political decision makers in Ecuador. Why? Because the perfect storm created a lot of social pressure, and that ended in general strikes. That was an invitation from going from political populism, as usual, to political madness, and from bad fiscal deficits to massive fiscal deficits. So this was a very critical situation. And in that moment, the team of doctors in my country, those of the people that were working for the government, decided that the only way to fix this was to cut the possibility to the populists to create more deficits. And to handcuff their hands, we needed to impede the printing of money in Ecuador. And the way for doing that was to adopt the dollar of the United States, because we could, irresponsible as we had been behaving for so many decades, we could print the sucre, which was the national currency, but you cannot print dollars. So you put a kind of a straitjacket there that, of course, constrains those movements. Now, that was a very risky operation. No other country have done that before. You can say El Salvador, but El Salvador dollarized 1 year after Ecuador. You can say Panama, but Panama started as a country with the two currencies, the Balboa and the dollar. Nobody has resigned the national currency and substitute for another one. You can say Argentina, but Argentina adopted something very close to the dollarization, the convertibility, but it was not the same. So to be the first in the world doing something is very risky, of course. And then you can have collateral effects, as with the liver transplant. You have to be prepared for that. So with that, we prepare for the treatment, for the replacement of the sucre for the dollar. I am convinced that, and this is so important for a school of public policy, because we really value public policy and we really value to prepare students and future members of governments to do a better job. You need what I call a table with 3 legs. One leg is the technical leg. In this case, it is the economy. You have to do your homework, you have to be prepared, you have to be sure that your decision is right, and you have all the economic answers to all the economic questions about this. Then the second point is that you need the social acceptance of your situation. In the case of Dan, you need a patient consent to get a new lever. In the case of a country, you need a social consent for living with different policies. One of the problems with adjustments to the previous paradigm is the reaction, the rejection of the population, what they called IMF procedures. And then you need the third thing. If you have the right economic decision and the people are ready to use that, you need political viability. You cannot do that on your own. We needed at least two things in Ecuador. First, according to the Constitution, it was the central bank, the only institution authorized to make the decision to dollarize. And then you need to change so many laws to make the new scheme workable that you need to go to Congress and you need to pass laws creating the new system. So that's what we did in January 2000. Now, continuing with the comparison or analogy, these were our principles. First, chiefs of state resolve dilemmas, not problems. A working definition. A dilemma is a problem that you can only solve by creating other problems. There's no free lunch, we used to say. Second, problems are not your enemy. Hidden problems are. If you don't see them, if you try to hide them under the carpet, then you are going into dire straits. Third, economic laws are not lethal. To ignore those laws or to contradict them, it is lethal. Four, do not decide anything in public policy before knowing what, the why, the what for, the how, the where, the when, and the with what, which resources do you have, and knowing how are you going to evaluate the success or not of your decision. And then you have to decide what kind of knot are you dealing with. It is a usual knot that with some patience and skills and abilities you can untie, or it is a Gordian knot that from the old ancient mythology is a knot that every time you try to fix or to untie, you make it worse. So in that case, as Alexander the Great did it according to the legend, you need to cut the knot. You cannot untie the knot. So we decided that we were leaving a Gordian knot in Ecuador. So the way to cut it was to change the sucre for the dollar. And finally, in politics, and I would say in life, it is not enough to be right. You have to be right on time. And what we were prepared post-op after the surgery, after adopting the dollar, we expected initial complications. In the case of Dan, he had 2 cardiac arrests, a general infection. In the case of Ecuador, we had high inflation the first year. The accommodation to the new situation, of course, brought pain and difficulties to adjust. Then we knew we need to follow up the process and to manage the process. To dollarize or any public policy, as we know, is not an event, it is a process that has precedents and will have consequences, and you have to monitor that. So in the case of Dan, he needed anti-rejection medicine, regular controls. In the case of Ecuador and its dollarization, we needed legal reforms, political discipline. Then there's a risk of dying, always. I used to say that dollarization is a living being. And how can a patient die? If you stop breathing, you stop eating, you stop moving. You have the same kind in the case of the dollar in Ecuador. if you have the crowding out of the public expenditures and the government takes all the money of the country and leave nothing for the private sector to invest, you have a problem of breathing. If you do not export, if you have the wrong policies and you cannot get dollars coming into the country, you stop eating because dollar is the food of dollarization. And finally, if you tie the hands of the economy with excessive regulations, wrong laws, etc., you are impeding the movement of this new being. So yes, you can die. And you can die for any of those kind of circumstances, mainly, but can be others. So you have to be ready to face that. Now, when we decided to publish the book, we went through this 4-quadrant tool. The book has a personal narrative. We decided to publish this as a novel, as a memory, meaning making it as readable as possible. This is a technical matter. This can be very boring. This can be very complicated. This could be dedicated to experts in the area. We try the opposite. We try to write something that almost anybody could be able to understand. Plain language, full of stories and examples. That's one. Second, in the symptoms, we describe the perfect storm. Third, we have a part of rational analysis. How did we come to the conclusion that dollarization was a good option? Then we produce a historical interpretation of what happened at that moment and what happened later in the following 20 years. And then we try to have a balanced subjective judgment. And so the book follows that kind of structure as well. Now we are 20 years after we made the decision. Interesting enough, more than 90% of the people in Ecuador do not want to hear about changing the dollar for any other currency. Why? Because they receive the benefits. From hyperinflation, we have had one-digit inflation for 20 years. By definition, we eliminated depreciation, devaluation. We were able to bring the rates of inflation and the interest rates to international levels. Never before. Ecuador was always high, high, high. And we guaranteed the purchasing power of the population. So they could earn the same amount of money in January and in December, because there was no depreciation due to the inflation. So they became credit subjects. They could buy many things paying installments. They didn't receive credit before because they were so untrustable. So we put the basis for the starting of a more robust middle class in Ecuador. And for the entrepreneurs, you always have heard that you lose competitivity if you do something like this, adopt the dollar. Because if other countries devalue, you cannot devalue. And if the other countries are exporting the same goods that you're exporting, they can put those goods cheaper in the world market. And we thought that could be a problem. And I emphasize could be a problem. Because for a person in the private sector, he could have been losing this possibility of devaluation, which is not the best way to be competitive, because you are hitting the salaries of the workers mainly. But on the other hand, you are receiving stability. So the trade-off is losing the capacity to devalue versus paying rational interest rates, not being able to plan for the future with rational inflations, not knowing what will happen the next day with inflation or with the price of the currency. So in general, nobody says that this has been free. We have been paying some prices. However, most of the people, 90+%, says we prefer to stay with the dollar. We don't want to hear anything different than that. So finally, 2 or 3 quotes that were important for me, and I will stop there to continue with this good scheme that you have for today. Robert Kennedy used to say, some people see the things as they are, and they ask why. Sometimes I see the things that haven't been yet, and I ask, why not? So you need some trust in the future to take some risks. Then I found something very interesting from Diego Armando Maradona. In one interview, he said, when my teammates decided to give the ball to me, I used to resolve. That is how you gain respect. That is how you become a leader. Not by washing your hands and passing the ball to others, but by facing the risks and making decisions. We have 3 ideas about that. The first one from Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, that human beings are fatally forced to make decisions, to choose. Only animals react by instinct. They don't have to decide. They just react. Human beings are different. And how do we decide? We decide based on our nature and our nurture, and on what we are and what is the context. From there comes the famous phrase, yo soy yo y mis circunstancias, and I am I and my circumstances. So that is the second one. And the third one is that being the decisor in chief and being the communicator in chief of his or her decisions is the core of the job of a chief of state. You cannot delegate that. So I will stop there, saying finally that this, as Dan's operation, he needed a team of doctors. He needed a surgeon of the heart, he needed a surgeon of the liver, anesthesiologist, etc., etc. In the case of Ecuador, we needed a team of economical doctors. We have to measure the impact in the Ministry of Finance. We need the support of the Superintendent of Banks, what will be the implications there. We need the perspective from the Central Bank. We need the opinion of the legal department of the presidency. We need to change laws related to the Constitution, etc., etc. We consulted experts internationally. In the case of Argentina, Domingo Cavallo and his team of the Fundación Mediterráneo, and the case of Ricardo Hausmann. At that time, Ricardo Hausmann was the chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank. So thank God we could count with their experience and their ideas, and that's why they are part of our book, because they wrote as a memoir as well, what they felt, how they proceed, what they learned in that experience. And finally, we needed the support of the general manager of the central bank. Unfortunately, his name is Miguel Davila, and Miguel died of COVID the day that the book was being published by Amazon electronically. Miguel was the person who imagined how to produce the change of sucres by dollars on the street, in the street, the real operation for the people. So I will stop there, and I hope that you will find interesting what you can read there or what we are going to talk today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is not often that we have a guest who quotes Bobby Kennedy, Ortega y Gasset, and Maradona in the same presentation. I think that is a testament to the breadth of your thinking and the ambition of your project. You know, as a dean of a school of public policy, I can say there's food for thought for students like our students along many, many dimensions. There's the technical issue, of course. When is it advisable to give up your own currency and adopt a foreign currency, in this case, the dollar? There is the political economy issue. How do you get there? Mm-hmm. But I think in this case, what is unusual and of particular interest is also your reflections on leadership, how it is that a government, how it is that a head of state comes to that very tough decision. How does one conceptualize the problem? Whom does one consult? Who do you talk to? Do you bring in the Argentines or the Venezuelans or the Brazilians or the Brits? And in the end, how do you do it? And of course, as you know, Mr. President, this is a school of public policy. Our students are future ministers of finance or central bank presidents or ministers of social development, or perhaps, why not, prime ministers and heads of state. So to get a sense of how things are done, how leadership is actually exercised, is absolutely unique and absolutely fascinating. I could go on, but I'm going to restrain myself. We have a highly qualified discussant talking about people who have been in positions of leadership. She is very well known to the students of the School of Public Policy, but just in case, let me mention to those of you who might have joined from outside the LSE that Vanessa Rubio is a professor of practice at the School of Public Policy. She is the former Deputy Minister of Finance in Mexico. She also served as Deputy Minister of Social Development and as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. She was a G20 Sherpa on behalf of the government of Mexico. She was a senator in the Mexican Congress, and she also ran a presidential campaign. So she has been in many a position of leadership and a very distinguished career in public service in Mexico, and we're very lucky for the last couple of years to have had her as professor of practice here at the School of Public Policy. So without further ado, over to you, Vanessa, and we look forward to your thoughts on President MAHUAD's wonderful book and wonderful presentation.
Thank you so much, Dean Velasco, and of course, it's an absolute honor, President MAHUAD, to be here sharing this event with you. You said that you hope that the book is interesting. I would say that the book is beyond interesting, and for anyone that wants to read how policymakers and decision makers face tough decisions in crisis moments, like you did. Not only in terms of the dollarization of Ecuador, but also in just a term of 17 months, you did a peace treaty with Peru. You also did the revenue service of your country. You also did one of the most important social programs across Latin America. I remember whenever the World Bank spoke about social programs in Latin America, they spoke about Mexico, Prospera or Oportunidades, and they also spoke about the program you implemented in your country, in Ecuador. And also you made a very relevant policy around the protection of Yasuni. So I think that you have a huge experience to share, and I am really pleased and honored to share some reflections on your marvelous book. I would start by saying that it's a very honest, very well-crafted, and very well-narrated book. As you said, it is technical, but at the same time, it's political economy, no? So it's serious and it's amicable at the same time. It has method, but it's very approachable. It feels like an intimate conversation with you on the reflection of the events, the circumstances, the context, and I would underline the context because you mentioned that throughout your book. Context is very relevant for any decision making, for any policy choice. That surrounded this dollarization of Ecuador. You mentioned some of the international context, but I was thinking of 1994, tequila crisis in Mexico, no, of course, then the Asian crisis of 1997, the oil price collapse that economies like Ecuador, like Mexico, very much suffered in terms of public revenues. The financial crisis that dried financial markets in Latin America. In 1998, the fourth largest Ecuadorian banks had failed. The hyperinflation of 91%. Nowadays, we're worried about the inflation of 7%, of 9%. No, this was an inflation of 91%. The devaluation, the interest rates, and the outflows of capital. So that is a serious crisis. That is a serious moment to be deciding on, plus the very complex domestic context in terms of political instability and social instability. So that's quite a mixture of challenges that you face during that decision, no? And of course, the dollarization of the economy came as the option to stabilize the economy and to exit the crisis, no? On that Sunday night of January 9, year 2000, you went to pronounce a very short communication to the public, but I thought it was a quite brave one. I actually went to the video to watch it over again. And you mentioned this. You mentioned, I have reached the conclusion that dollarization system is convenient and necessary. And I will mention before in my remarks why it's important the I part of it. You didn't mention we, you didn't mention all of the government. You were assuming the responsibility of a head of state because you were making that decision, no? And as you mentioned, that is actually being a head of state, and that's actually being a person of state, no? I think it's a very honest reflection of decision-making, first-hand decision-making in the context of crisis, and it is enormously relevant to understand issues such as history, political systems, institutions, context, regional context, national context, international context, the difference between public policy and politics, that I very much enjoyed reading about it. The fact of having very robust information, sound advice, the analysis of different options, of scenarios at that point in time. Maybe you can elaborate a little afterwards on what those scenarios were like and those policy options and why you opted for this and not for other. And understanding and dealing with stakeholders. No, you need to engage, you need to positively engage with all of the stakeholders that had a saying in that decision making. No. There is this course I teach at the School of Public Policy called Decision-Making Process, Challenges and Outcomes. And I couldn't think that it was an impeccable case to share with my students for the next term, because it exactly goes through that whole process of how decisions are made and how you can actually create sound decision-making in a context like this. Even though you have time constraints, even though you have political constraints, you can always make space, time, and consideration for the right policy, choice. And of course, I think that although you had a group of people that were near you, that gave you information, that gave you several advice and considerations, at the end, the head of state is alone. It's a very lonely position, no? And because you are the one that is making the choice, you are the one that has, the weight on your shoulders. And I go back to that appearance in national television saying, I am the one responsible and I am the one that is accountable in historic terms for this decision. And I think this was a quite brave thing to do, and chapeau for that, Mr. President. And usually decisions that are taken at the head of state level, I always tell my students, are not black and white. They usually different shades of gray. And those decisions that are taken to the head of state are the most difficult ones. They are not the ones that the undersecretary took. They're not the ones that the minister took. They're the ones that have a more degree of complexity and more degree of relevance. And once the ones that you know that are going to be having a greater effect on the future generations. No, so that's what makes these decisions even more challenging, and what requires leaders, and what requires leaders that are willing to make those decisions in a very brave manner. And sometimes those decisions are not the best decision. They're the second best, or they're the third best, or they're the fourth best, because that's exactly what you need to do. And you mentioned that in your comments, President. Sometimes you maybe have advisors, or maybe academics, or maybe from international institutions. They show you what might be the best decision. Yes, but one thing is to have that in a vacuum, in a written paper, and the other one is going to the stakeholders and negotiate that in Congress, going to the stakeholders and negotiate that with the private sector and with the international investors and with the private sector at home, no? So feasibility is also a very relevant element about decision making, no? So I want to thank the book for all of its angles, its thoroughness, but I also felt a very important vindication of professional policymakers, no? Even of technocrats. And maybe I was identifying myself in some parts of the book, no? And particularly at this international context of polarization and you know, a lot of leaders in the world that are tending to be very politicized and populistic. It's like a balm to read that there's a possibility of vindicating good policies, of sound and technical policies in the one hand, but also politically effective in the other hand, and socially viable. Speaking about that triad you mentioned about, no? So they don't have to be excluding. They can be technical and sound, they can be politically feasible, and they can be well regarded by the society. So my last comment, I think at this point in time, will be that all of the policies will be challenged, they will be criticized, and they will be debated. And that's part of the essence of democracy. And that's good that we have all these debates around policy choices. But I would go to two questions to understand and to evaluate policies. One was, did it serve its purpose? And I think it did. The purpose was stability, and the purpose was ending a crisis. And the second one was, did it remain over time? And here we have 2 years afterwards, 6 presidents in Ecuador afterwards, the subprime crisis, the COVID crisis, the Ukraine crisis, the inflation, and counting. And that policy is still there, and is there for a reason. Sometimes, in my case, we took very challenging decision. One was, you know, to liberalize the oil market and, you know, take away the subsidies back in 1997. Very challenging, very tough decision. One that remained, of course, over time, that was highly criticized. We decided to, you know, create some private investment in the state-owned enterprise, Pemex. That decision did not stay throughout time because we had a huge political change in my country. But I think if one goes and rounds your book in these two elements, I think you should be proud and that you did the right choice and the right thing. No, the policy achieved its goal, and the policy is still there after these 22 years. So I think I will end my comments here. I have much more. Maybe in the questions, I would dare to make 1 or 2 other questions to you, Mr. President. But thank you for giving me this opportunity to give these comments to your fascinating book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you. Those were great insights. And I very much like the way you put it together at the end. You know, when making such momentous decisions, 2 decades have gone past, and, you know, one has to focus on the big issues. One issue, number one, was, did it bring monetary stability to the country? That was the one thing that was lacking at the time. Secondly, did it stick? Many of these big changes don't stick. You mentioned a couple in Mexico that didn't stick. This one has, and I think that is remarkable. We have about 35 minutes left, maybe a little bit more, 37 if I get precise. And I'm going to take the liberty of asking President MAHUAD 2 quick questions, and then I will make sure that we have at least half an hour to take questions from the audience, and Vanessa may have a few points of her own. We have 5 questions in the Q&A function already. We may have time for a couple more, so if anybody has a question, guys, you know, dear students from the LSE or guests from elsewhere, don't be shy, just write them in to the Q&A function in Zoom. But Mr. President, let me ask you 2 questions, and one is going to be fairly abstract and the other one is going to be very concrete and practical. The abstract one is the following. You know, I'm a student of exchange rate policy, and so I've been thinking about dollarization. I've been thinking about common currencies like, you know, the euro, in which, you know, France and Italy and so many countries in Europe gave up their currencies. And such decisions are, of course, hard, and you know that better than anybody else. But they can also be described in very different terms. On the one hand, they bring stability. They bring some problems too, and we'll turn to those, but they bring stability, and in that sense, you know, their achievement. But there is a sense in which, and I'm going to try to, you know, phrase this very carefully, having to adopt somebody else's currency is a symptom of an underlying weakness, politically speaking, in the country. It is not a coincidence that, you know, Spain and Italy and Portugal and Greece were very keen to adopt the new currency, the euro, because these were countries that had historically great difficulty disciplining themselves monetarily and fiscally. In the case of Ecuador, this is an achievement, but to what extent, if you reflect back in the big sweep of Ecuadorian political history, does it also reflect a larger failure of Ecuadorian society and Ecuadorian politics, of having been able to build the domestic institutions that would have allowed Ecuador to have its own currency? Do you view that as a shortcoming, or do you view the benefits as so important relative to the costs that is a footnote that we can simply sweep under the carpet of history?
Thank you. I would like to start saying how grateful I feel with Vanessa for so many things. First, you have taken the time to read the book. Not only read it, but study it. And try to understand and extract the main parts, the process we, the authors, went through. That takes time and takes interest, so thank you very much. And second, you have made such a wonderful summary of it that shows your capacity and your ability to distinguish the important things from the secondary ones. And third, thank you for your comments. So that first and foremost. Second, I would like, yeah, Andres, I agree with the implicit, maybe the implicit answer to the question. One of the main pains I have now is to hear from so many people that read the book. We were fortunate. That was the best-selling book in Ecuador for many months. And then that in the list of the 10 best-selling books. So many people telling me, I read your book, and that is what we are living here now in Ecuador. So we haven't learned anything. So if that is a failure, and I am not afraid of using the word, I would say yes, it is a failure, because we are repeating the same problems. Basically, our incapacity to listen. It's famous that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we should listen to more than we speak. Well, we forget frequently that in my country. Second, the incapacity to get agreements, to compromise on the minimum things to make the country advance. The political confrontation is there as strong as usual. I have my own interpretation about why that happens. We are not bad people. We have a strong historical, cultural, geographical reasons for doing so many things differently. With one problem, if I am going to talk to Vanessa, I know she's from Mexico. With you, Andres, I know you're from Chile. I have in the back of my mind the knowledge that I am dealing with people that are not from my country. So somehow I am prepared for that. But if you deal with other Ecuadorians, you assume you are dealing with your fellows. And in some ways we are so different that we do not take into account that. So yes, I am happy that these policies that you mentioned have stayed. I think that I owe a lot of the things I did to my studies here at the Kennedy School. I understood public policy, I understood the requisites, I understood how in the implementation can be the problem. Not only is it a matter of design, you need to be very clear about in which cultural context we are going to use that. What I call in the book the CUCO test, Q for cultural, CO for compatibility. So how cultural compatible this decision is, and try to find something that fits your culture. And unfortunately, we haven't decided how to deal with the same old problems, and we're making the same old mistakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. One more quick one from me, and then you may want to add a few thoughts to what Vanessa had to say, or we'll open it up to students. But what I'm about to ask you is in the book, but of course, the book is a long book and you didn't have the time to give us some of the local color. And I very much hope you will do it. You know, we have an audience here of LSE students, of public policy students, much like your students at the Kennedy School, who are thinking, when I get to be president of my country, or when I get to be finance minister of my country, or when I get to be central bank president of my country, give us a little flavor, Mr. President, of, you know, and you mentioned this in the book, what were the moments in which you realized that you'd have to take this big step? You know, those of us who've been in government know that, you know, we mull things over, we think about them in the morning and at night and in the middle of the night sometimes when we cannot go to sleep. But then there's a moment, maybe at a meeting, maybe during a walk, maybe alone in a car, when you think, oh, you know, the time has come. We have to, you know, jump over this chasm. We have to make this very tough choice. Can you just tell our students a little bit, Mr. President, of what that was like? You know, what was the process leading to this decision, and where were you, and what were you doing when you said, "Eureka, we've got to do this"? And then, of course, you pushed through, as you describe very eloquently in the book.
Thank you, Andres. 2 or 3 anecdotes that they constituted big lessons for me. One is from Roger Fisher. He was a great mentor for me on negotiation. He usually distinguished the why from the what for. Many times we confuse them. He used to say, if you hit somebody and I ask you why, don't answer me back. I hit him because he hit me first. I am asking you for what? What is the purpose? You have, both of you, Vanessa and you, Andres, have used the word purpose. What is the purpose of hitting that person? It's not just a retribution. So that's a very important moment. And the second, Ted Kennedy was the most the favorite candidate for the presidency of the United States many years ago, and he gave a wonderful interview. And at the end of the interview, in which he showed everything he knew about everything, was so well prepared on almost anything. The question was, why do you want to be president of the United States? And Senator Kennedy took some seconds to elaborate a very well-crafted answer. But those 5-6 seconds of doubt mark that presentation as the most important moment. Because in the voters, I have read that from many different sources saying the same thing. For voters, if you don't have a clear idea of what for why you are going there, something is not well established yet. And we have to ask that question before entering any political campaign. If I go there, what is the purpose? Because the moment that you are there, with all these problems, when you are in the academia, Ricardo Hausmann likes to stress that, you choose your problems. Mm-hmm. You decide to write about A, B, or C, but both of you have been in the public sector. There, the problems chose you. You have to deal with whatever comes to you. Mm-hmm. And those are not the moments to really go to the deeper of yourself. At that moment, you react based on who you are, on what you have beneath. You are like an iceberg. So you are the tip there, but what do you have in so many years of experience? And if you decide that you go there to serve in the first place, that helps a lot to make decisions. I found four reasons why people want to get power. Mm-hmm. One is raw power. Mm-hmm. They want to show who is the boss. And they want to use the power to settle problems. The second is to get some perks that come with power, money, etc. The third is fame, glory, reputation. And the fourth is service. Yes, it is service, as with medical doctors, with lawyers, with everybody. Now, I don't believe in angels and demons. I think we are just human beings, all of us. And we have these four elements in different percentages. And the special mixture, the special composition of our formula makes us what we are. So if the part of service is important, you can take the decisions, make the decisions that are needed. And something I put in the book that I really love, and thank God I read that when I was 18, is this conversation between Socrates and the general from Sparta. Mm-hmm. When Socrates asked, what is courage? And the general from Sparta said, courage is always going forward and never going back. And Socrates, who understood that only when you can produce a doubt, a moment of hesitation with a question, the other can learn something. It's so important for teachers that, for professors. Said, okay, but imagine that you are heading a troop and you discover you have been ambushed, you are going to be exterminated because you are facing a dead end. Your only way out is going back. What would you do? And he said, I would go back because the main responsibility of a commander is to protect the life of the troop. And he said, I understand. So by going back, you fulfill your responsibility, but by doing that, you are acting cowardly. And the general tried to kill Socrates, and he stopped him and said, no, you are right. Because courage is the obedience of a serene judgment. You can have your serene judgment if you want mainly here, not only here, but mainly here. But when you come to the conclusion of what to do. You have to leave your criteria, and you need to let appear the courage. Because the courage is the obedience to the criteria. And sometimes the decisions are so difficult, are so dangerous. You know what is coming to you, and you have to do it. So great decision makers, I think, Vanessa, have 50-50, criteria and courage. We need both. So those are the lessons that help me to act in those terrible moments when you don't have time and you have to decide. Because what is the peak of a crisis? The peak of a crisis combines three elements. First, an urgency to decide. You don't have time. Second, enormous stakes is the difference between war and peace. Yeah? And third, you cannot be sure that you have all the information that you would like to have. As we like to joke here, this is not a case study. You don't have all the charts, all the information. No, no, no. You have to act and decide with whatever you have in your hands.
Thank you, Mr. President. Vanessa, would you like to come in and add a few thoughts before we turn it over to the questions, or we just jump to the questions?
No, please. Time for the students. I've taken enough time. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Mr. President. Again, Vanessa, thank you very, very much. We may have some time to return to you at the very end. So we have 6 questions. I'm going to group them in sort of piles of 2, Mr. President, if I may. We have some more economic questions and some more political questions. So the first question I want to pose to you, and I will ask 2 in this round, is the first one is from Daksha Vivek, who does not identify himself or herself, but I imagine it's someone from the LSE. And the question is, instead of dollarizing the economy, did you consider introducing a new currency like Germany did with the Deutschmark after the collapse of the Reichsmark? And then Sol Espinosa, an LSE alumni from Ecuador, says, what do you think of the social cost of dollarization? Did it make life hard for older people? Did it make life hard for the middle class? And did it, harm the ability of Ecuadorian firms to compete against neighbors like Colombia and Peru? So those are the 2 more economic questions. Let me begin with those. We'll talk about some political questions next time around, Mr. President.
Okay. Well, the first one, why did we choose the dollar? Because we were part of the dollar part of the world. We were so close to the United States physically first. Second, our main exports and imports go there and come from there. Third, my country, as any other country in the world, was using mainly the dollar as the currency for the international commerce. Mm-hmm. So it was not in our radar the possibility of using any other external currency. Now, why don't you create an Ecuadorian new currency? Because the Ecuadorians lost trust in our currency. Every person who could was using the sucres to buy dollars. So they were saving in dollars. They were selling sucres as fast as possible. And to create a new currency would have been a titanic effort, mainly to fail. How do you convince your people that because you are changing the sucre for something else, they will trust the something else? When the trust in the capacity of the country to deal rationally with some currency has been destroyed or disappeared. So that is why we didn't consider that. Was a process of elimination. We considered convertibility as an option, but we have had many conversations with Domingo Cavallo about this. In the case of Argentina, he had and was successful for some years, he had the idea that the Argentinian peso could coexist with the dollar. In the case of Ecuador, we thought that the sucre could not coexist with the dollar because nobody wanted sucres. That's a label, but to make it clear. This is the first question. And the second question was about, sorry,
it was about social costs.
Yeah.
And difficulties for firms when they have to compete against other firms with countries with floating exchange rates like Colombia and Peru.
Okay. Well, the first part I think was explained in my introduction.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, when you eliminate inflation, when you eliminate devaluation,
mm-hmm.
you are protecting the purchasing power of the salaries of the retired people, etc. We had a first year of high inflation. That was the initial shock. Mm-hmm. But then everything was stable. So it was the opposite. The decision protected that better than not having it. And the second is something new. It's very important, that part, because there are a lot of studies now. One of them is being published very soon by the Minister of Finance, who helped me to dollarize, Alfredo Arizaga. And he's comparing what has been the behavior of the exports of countries near to Ecuador. Because there's a problem there. If you want to compare, what do you compare to what? And the most obvious comparison for us is to compare with Peru and with Colombia, our neighbors. And in the case of Colombia, because our economies are competitive, with Peru we are more complementary than competitive. And the conclusions that Alfredo had got, and says that in the article that will appear soon, is that the reality shows that happened the opposite to what the theory expected. The non-oil exports of Ecuador has multiplied by 7 in these years. And second, we have had more success probably than the countries with very active central banks monitoring the currency to try to promote exports. So I would say let's have some patience. Let's see those charts, those comparisons. And I'm so happy because many more will come. This is a current discussion now in Argentina, for example. And we have to study, we have to learn. We have much more information now because Ecuador dollarized, El Salvador dollarized, than 22 years ago when we didn't have anything but theories and expectations.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me move on to somewhat more political questions, and there are a couple of them. One is a very brief question from Sonali, who's an LSE alumni from Sri Lanka. And the question is, how did you convince your parliament to agree to this very difficult decision you made? And there's a longer question from Diego Basante, who is the IBM head from government affairs for the Andean countries. And he was once an Ecuadorian career diplomat. He's writing from Bogota. And he says, President MAHUAD, in your book, page 87, this is somebody who's read the book, you argue, it's a very long question, so I'm going to summarize it. You argue that the Ecuadorian president did not really have all the power people thought he had, and that effectively the president's hands were tied. And, you know, the power was really, in your description, in the hands of the Congress to the point of crippling the executive. A few years later, the question adds, President Rafael Correa, who of course was among your successors in the office of head of state of Ecuador, made a similar argument. He railed against, you know, the poderes fácticos and the partidocracia, and as a result, Ecuador wrote a new constitution that gave the president a lot more power in Ecuador. So, you know, with that experience in mind, was it really a good idea to give the president more powers? Does the president really have a lot more power in Ecuador today? Is that a good idea? again, the question is quite long and I'm trying to summarize, but I think you get the gist, Mr. President. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, let's start by the second question. What is politics? There are so many definitions of politics. From a very practical point of view, I like the idea that politics is the way we have to decide who gets what and who pays the price. Mm-hmm. So from a distribution point of view, that is it. So in Ecuador, we used to elect in those times, for example, mayors and presidents the same day. And they came from the same political parties, were the same problems and merits, in the same day, with the same feeling of the population about politicians, etc. And usually, mayors, some of them had been presidents, were re-elected with higher votation, and some of them, mayors that now try to become presidents, had very bad results. How do you explain that? Mm-hmm. Probably because when you have a city, you have a constituency that is much more homogeneous than in a so diverse country as Ecuador is. I used to say that the task of being president of Ecuador is like being the mayor of Boston and Miami at the same time. So different. So how do you please both of them? And then when you have to approve public policies, for example, if you decide and an export led economic growth, promote exports more than the development hacia adentro. Mm-hmm. You are favoring one region in Ecuador at that time, because on the coast was exporting the Sierra, no. And half of the population lived in the Sierra, half in the Costa. So it was very difficult, very difficult. Now, this country usually had elected a president and a Congress to control the president. And it can be good if you want a democracy. It is terrible if you want something done. Because the Congress thinks that its function is to oppose the president. And usually the opposition won the next election. So it was a big incentive to do the opposition, not to help the president, whoever he is, but to oppose him. Now, it was composed, that problem was composed by the way we elected our parliamentarians. We voted in the first round. We have a ballotage system. So many different political candidates. So the votes came to many different political parties. Only Brazil at that time had more political effective parties, meaning with representation in Congress, than Ecuador. But Brazil is a continent and we are a very small country. So that was one problem. And the second problem was the way you decided how to assign the seats in Congress. Correa changed that and went more with the winner takes it all way of thinking. So he got majority in Congress. He never had that problem. Other presidents have had that, and the current president have had. So I believe in strong presidents. I believe that you need to control them, because not every strong president is as abusive as Correa was. Mm-hmm. But the opposite is to have weak presidents that cannot deliver anything, and that is terrible for democracy.
That is a very important point, Mr. President. You know, as you and I have discussed, the combination of party fragmentation, very proportional systems for electing parliaments and presidential systems makes Latin America very, very difficult to govern. You know, a president elected with a mandate, but with a small minority of votes in parliament has a very difficult time indeed. And that's true nowadays in Ecuador, it's true in Brazil, it is true in Colombia, it is true in Peru, it is true in Chile, pretty much all over the place. We have a couple more questions with more of an international flavor. I'm going to lump them together, Mr. President, and then we will come to a close. Let me begin with a question from, where did the question go? Here we go. Kunal Pawa, who's a student, an LSE student from Singapore, says that, you know, you described your experience in seeking foreign advice as managing a team of doctors. Kunal is wondering if there were any traits or any lessons that you found valuable in guiding that team through a very uncertain time. In the same vein, sort of also kind of an internationally minded question, Carla Paredes says that, you know, the way you describe it, dollarization seems appealing. It seems like a good way to promote economic stability. But Carla points out that we have not seen an increase in the number of countries adopting the dollar as their currency. So why do you think, Mr. President, that is so? And last but not least, Dashka Vivek again would like to know about your views regarding El Salvador's legalization of Bitcoin. As you pointed out, Mr. President, El Salvador was one country that dollarized shortly after Ecuador did, but the current president of Ecuador is not content with having gotten rid of the local currency and having adopted the dollar. He's also allowing Bitcoin to be legal tender in that country. A very controversial decision. Some people, myself included, think it's not a particularly wise decision, but of course, we want to hear your views on it. We have about 5 minutes left, Mr. President, so back to you.
Thank you. I believe in teamwork. You cannot do important things in government without a teamwork. And it is important, how do you make the team? How do you choose who will integrate the team? In my view, it is important not to have yes men or yes people there. If you have somebody there just to say yes to what you want, one of you is excessive, is unnecessary. Okay? You can get better that from a mirror. I prefer to hear all the problems in my cabinet. That was always my preference. I prefer to know the problems there and not published after in the newspapers because there was nobody there to tell me this is going to happen or this is the bad side. So lead the team, and that means protecting deviant voices. Otherwise, you can go to the group thinking, which is terrible. They manage to eliminate discordance, and you lose the capacity to hear critics. So that's an important lesson. And second, put the rules of the game clear since the beginning. You have to show them to what kind of arguments and logic you are open, so they learn how to convince you of something. What kind of evidence you need. And that happens during the exercise of the reunions, etc. And why other countries haven't adopted the dollar? It is interesting. As soon as I arrived to Harvard, my country was growing 5% that year, which was almost a record. And they were saying this is because of the dollar, some people. And I was saying, no, 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 go slowly. Last year, we decreased 7%. So you need to see the film, not just the picture. And I am not an apostle of dollarization. I do not preach dollarization. I think That was the right decision for my country at that moment. Quoting Stanley Fisher, he told Ricardo Hausmann, that was the right medicine for that patient in that moment. I like that formulation. So I am convinced of that. But I don't think that you have to go to dollarize all over the world. Each country should analyze the situation. But if you cannot produce political agreements, if you cannot have a horizon, have a national plan with national objectives and implement it, and you're going from one side to the other like a piece of balsa in the ocean with no direction, it is much better to constrain the people and to adopt the dollar. That would be my summary. You are muted, Andres.
Sorry about that. We all make that mistake. I was saying, Mr. President, that we are nearly at our time limit, but I do want to make sure that we give my colleague Vanessa Rubio the opportunity to chime in, provide some closing thoughts, and then I'm afraid, Mr. President, we will have to call it a day. Vanessa, over to you.
Thank you so much, Andres, and thank you again, Mr. President. As I was reading the book, I was thinking how much we decision makers in different levels of government owe this to citizens and owe this to world citizens, because I really think it's a kind of an accountability process, because you were not speaking to the mirror, you were speaking honestly on how the process took place, what the challenges were in front of you. And again, I would underline the robustness of the whole narrative and the whole exercise you very well do. So I would only say that it's a book that is worth reading. That is a book, you were just saying that you are not an apostle of dollarization, but I would say that you're an apostle of sound public policy and sound decision making. And for that reason, I think anyone interested in that and the history of Latin America decision making should be reading that book. And I am commending you again, Mr. President, for writing it and for sharing it today with us. And thank you, Andres, for inviting me to make some comments here.
On the contrary, thank you, Vanessa, for those thoughts, illuminated by your very own experience, of course, in also exercising leadership in the realms of finance and social policy. Mr. President, we have about 1 minute left. Can I ask for any closing thoughts or messages you might have for our audience?
Well, first, thank you very much. Second, it is so interesting and so fulfilling to have a conversation about public policy. Focus on that mainly, because it is not usual. And I love that angle in our conversation today. Second, I would love to talk to you, Vanessa, about your class, about the decision-making class. Love to learn more. So let's produce that. And thank you to all the students that have been following this program, and to you, Andres. You have done so much for the academia, for your country as Minister of Finance in Chile. Thinking, reflecting. I am enjoying. I finished already your book about in times of
cholera.
In times of cholera. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. President. Those are very, very kind words. I thank you. And I thank Vanessa, and of course, I thank everybody who joined us from the London School of Economics, but also from overseas. As I look at the list of people who joined, we had people from several countries, current students, former students, members of the general public. Thank you to all of them. President MAHUAD, what a privilege and what an honor it is to host you at the LSE. And we will have that conversation on liberalism in times of cholera sometime sooner rather than later. Goodbye, everyone. And I will see you soon at some other LSE public policy event.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.